Good morning. Welcome to our morning meditation. I hope you're having a good morning this morning. I invite you, as I do every morning, to let your family and friends know about this meditation and time of reflection together. My hope is that each morning we will share a time to reflect on a work of a Unitarian Universalist and something from one of uh, our Transcendentalist forebearers, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and then spend some time in silence, maybe engaging a different reflection or something as we go along. Trying to build this so that there's a little bit of variety every week, every day, something for people to uh, reflect on in a different variety of ways, in a different meeting different needs. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you some reflections on a work around economic justice. And so it's, yesterday we did some music. Tomorrow we'll do some imagery work. But today I'll be doing a little bit more talking, or a lot more talking, excuse me, on the idea of economic justice and what it means to, how we're working economically in the country today. But to get started, I want to start with words from Ralph Waldo Emerson entitled Worship. Worship. The weight of the universe is pressed down on the shoulders of each moral agent to hold him to his task. The only path of escape known in all the worlds of God is performance. You must do your work before you shall be released. And so I think that the last lesson of life, the choral psalm which rises from all elements and all angels, is a voluntary obedience, a necessitated freedom. Man is made from the same atoms as the world is. He shares the same impressions, dispositions, and destiny. When his mind is illuminated, then his heart is kind. He throws himself joyfully into the sublime order and does with knowledge that which stones do by structure. In many traditions, it is believed that if you speak out loud your wish of goodwill, that it gives power to that wish. It makes it real, and it verbalizes it not only for yourself and for your own reflection, but for that of others. Therefore, I offer today up our disenfranchised, our unrepresented and underrepresented members of our community. I offer them up in the hope that we may do our work to reflect and act on their behalf. May we see them, hear them, and serve them. The poorest of the poor are not only living on the streets, but they are in jails, they are in cars, they are in shelters. And whether sometimes we want to live in the denial of it, we must recognize that the poorest of the poor live often in our homes, in our buildings, as our neighbors, as members of our community. They can also be our coworkers. our fellow congregants. They are people who rest with us, laugh with us, cry with us, and share with us. The poorest of the poor in this community are often those that we cannot see. And I ask that we hold them in our hearts today. And may we be called to serve them as we go forward in this time of uncertainty and distress that most of us live in this country today. I invite you now to speak the name of the loved one that you hold in your heart. Do that in live chat or do it out loud. But share that gift with the world of speaking the name of someone who you feel needs some love, some compassion, some help and assistance today. Today, I would like to focus on remembering the life of Paul Howard Douglas. Paul Howard Douglas was a Unitarian, an economist, and a U.S. Senator from Illinois. And today is the anniversary of his birth in 1892. He was born in Salem, Massachusetts, and he got his PhD degree in economics from Columbia University in 1921. In 1932, he wrote The Coming of a New Party, uh, advocating for a party similar to the Labour Party of Great Britain. In 1942, he was wounded in Okinawa, serving in World War II as a U.S. Marine. He was a member of All Souls Unitarian Church in Washington, D.C., and maintained both membership as Unitarian and as a Quaker in both traditions until his death in 1976. Well, my reflection today is from his work entitled, What Can Man Afford? In this work, he is assessing the ability to contribute to both charity and taxes in the 1920s. He is making an argument for service to the poor, justification for both contributions to charity and taxes, and how that should be allocated. And I believe we have a resounding need to hear, 100 years later, his work. While the numbers are changed, it's really interesting to see that ideologically and the philosophical basis for understanding economics of how a person can contribute to the large society is still the same. And I would like to share with you the opening chapter 1 of his essay. In these days of multitudinous drives for philanthropic purposes, every thoughtful man has to ask himself, how much can I afford to give? It is some rough and ready fashion. He has to answer that question for himself. But in its wider bearings, his problem becomes so enormously complex that only hope of an intimate solution for it is to generalize his situation to see what might reasonably be expected of the givers of our country as a whole. To this, we must begin facing the difficulties, psychological and conventional, and stand in the way of the average man's giving at all. I think this is really important because what he does is he addresses that giving is not only just a physical ability to do when you give, but is also has a psychological piece underneath it. What is the psychological perspective? But he does go on to discuss uh, both the need for taxation and charitable contributions. The argument that he makes is that for taxation is that taxation faces and meets public needs as a whole, and it's about equity and equality. He gives the reasons for taxation as, and posits that this is a good thing, that taxes are compulsory. Every person has to pay their share. I don't know if that's really true today, that everybody pays their share, but in his model, he's proposing that everybody pays their share. It can be estimated. Taxes can be budgeted, and systems can be built around it for public good. There are easy ways to collect taxes. There isn't a lot of money that has to go into collecting taxes. It's obligatory. The government says you have to do it. Everybody, there's a basic system set up, and people participate. And then fourth, and at the end of the day, he says the government can collect taxes because at the end of the day, the government holds the first lien on all property in the country, public and private. So basically, if you don't pay your taxes, going back to the obligatory part, your taxes could then result in a lien on your private property. On the other hand, he makes an argument about charitable giving. And he says charitable giving is designed to be experimental and adaptable, and it should be designed to meet the community needs. He says that philanthropic or charitable organizations have a passion and a zeal for serving the community. It's not something that's obligatory, but it should be something that's given out of a care and a concern and a want and a desire. Thirdly, he says voluntary organizations are more human. They maintain a personal touch. They hold a relationship between the donor and the benefactor. So it isn't some system that's set up in the outside that we don't understand or don't want. And fourth, he says that charitable organizations develop a character of donors that brings the community together. It helps the community to build and carry out a common project. He describes, in this instance of charitable giving, a bell curve. And it's interesting that his numbers from 1920 kind of have a common theme in 2020. What he describes as an annual income of $1,250 a year and a range up to $8.1 million a year, we could easily gauge that as today $1,250 a month to $8.1 million a month in income as the average person would make, right? Someplace in that scale. Just to make it easy, you can look at those curves, as a per month versus a per year basis. And what he states is that in his model is that at the lower end of the curve, the person who's making $1,200 or less a month, that their giving would be approximately 0.1% of their income. And at the peak of contributions, that would be about 27% of charitable giving. So the person making in the high hundred thousands would be contributing 27%. And then the curve drops down to about 19% for those at the highest income levels. And he's talking about charitable giving there. But it's really interesting that the model that he's proposing is not because people who are at the highest level, the 1 or 2%, as we would term it today, are not to give to charity. But what he's stating is that those people should be in the highest tax bracket. So therefore, their contributions to society, because they are receiving the most from society should also be giving back the most to the systems. So they should be contributing on the largest levels to the economy and back to taxes and whatnot. Um, so he doesn't describe that it's a lack of morality that those people are doing that reduction in charitable giving, but instead that they have a higher commitment, or they should have a higher commitment to give in taxes. The interesting part is what we have seen today, and where this comes to play today, is that we really don't have that system in place. The system, our governmental representatives, our tax systems, our society as a whole has been manipulated in a way that reduces taxes on the wealthiest, 1 or 2%. And therein lies our problem. So, what I would describe as the economic model that Douglas is proposing has not come to flourish because we have a problem that the model has not met, and that is the top 1 or 2% are not giving at their rates at the taxation level. But another piece and I want to draw just 2 points out in what he is sharing with us. So that's one, is he's talking about how in this model, charitable giving is differentiated from taxable giving. And taxes should be for the lower end of the economic scale, should be lower, and at the highest ends should be the highest. Well, charitable giving at the lowest end will be lower. There's a bell curve. The middle class, the upper middle class would be giving at the highest levels in charitable giving, and then again, charitable giving would decline at the highest levels. And I'll explain to you now what he describes as these economic levels. So the first level he describes is the poverty level. He describes those as people who cannot afford to make basic needs, such as housing, furnishing, clothing, and food. And their trajectory is to deteriorate rather than to ascend or to even maintain the status quo of their economic level, right? Their bills exceed their base bills, basic cost of living exceeds their income. So that's what he describes as poverty level 1. Then he names what he names as the minimum subsistence level. And for those people in that group, he says that those people are continuously able to make a budget. They create their lives and they live day by day, paycheck by paycheck. But they are not able to advance economically. What's happening is that they're just living status quo. They're the group that is, you lose a paycheck and then you can be back to the poverty level. You can be out on the street or, disenfranchised in a different way. But this minimum subsistence level is what he describes as just that group that we all know that is just living paycheck to paycheck. The third level he describes is what he calls the minimum comfort level. At this level, people are able to survive economically, they're able to make budgets, and they're able to break those budgets. They're able to, go out and buy their children toys or have a nice dinner, go out and get extra clothing and have celebrations. But they're just basically barely able to maybe ascend to the next level, right? They're still at that budgetary space where, it's maybe they'll have a little bit of savings, maybe they'll have a little bit of room in the belt, but they're really not a group that is able to really advance, move forward without lots of process over time. Then he gets what he calls the middle class, and then he describes the upper middle classes. What I think is really interesting is what he calls the middle class is what today we would call probably lower upper class, right? This is people who can do things like all that we've talked about before. They meet their needs. They can make a budget. They can have a little bit of savings maybe, but they can also do extra things like invest in stock. They can splurge on extras versus have an extra every once in a while. They can make contributions because of availability, not ability, but because of availability, they can make contributions to culture and economics because of their available resources and expenses. Now, this is not to say that the lower classes don't make contributions to culture or economics. He's just simply saying that this group is the group that has the availability because of their uh, time and resources. So they have this extra availability. And he goes on to describe the upper middle classes, but I'm not going to go into that um, today. I don't think it's really relevant to this conversation. But what I find interesting is that what he describes as the minimum comfort level is what most people today call the middle class. What we call middle class America in 2020 is really people just basically surviving, living at that one paycheck away from uh, um, destitution, or that one paycheck away from really having a financial crisis. What he describes in his model is that the middle class is much more looks like what we would consider today a professional class, a class of people who are able to uh, not only um, survive but thrive. And today, what we describe as the middle class is really a group that is just basically living to survive. So this is his model, right? And if we're to understand that model and then take it back to what people are to give in contribution to charitable giving or to taxes, and to juxtapose those two things against each other, we come to our problem. Our problem revolves around the fact that we are putting such high pressure on the what he would describe as um, the minimum comfort level class, the class that's barely making it. We put all of our pressure on that group to both pay the highest amount of taxes, and we call upon them for both charitable giving in both time, talent, and treasure, right? So that's the reflection that I want to give to you today is to look at and to understand that when we ask people to give, what are we asking them for, right? Who are we asking? And we are not asking what Douglas would propose is the middle class, the group that can contribute because of resources that is available to the larger society. And again, in his bell curve, what ends up happening is, so if we look at this, we come up with uh, this curve that comes up, in this trajectory, and this lower middle class, lower upper class, upper middle class group, which again, like I say, we would call the professional class today. Doctors, lawyers, people with, not not ministers, but people with master's degrees, and people who have, uh, um, professional. Uh, they're not the blue collar workers of the middle class that we would describe. We describe blue collar workers today as the middle class, but by this assessment, I would say that blue collar workers are really just of that minimum comfort level class. And that's the group that we put the most pressure on. So I ask you this, when we look at going forward, we look at what has happened yesterday with Congress authorizing, $2 trillion aid package. What does that look like today? Who does that actually benefit? Where are we actually going to distribute those resources? How does it disenfranchise the group that Douglas doesn't even address in here, the homeless? How does it address the homeless and the disenfranchised, the people that are living at the poverty level, people living below the middle class level. How is this money going to be distributed? So I ask you that as we go forward and we look at what is going on in our society today, that we look at and ask ourselves, and I know this is a bad word for many people, but how do we do a redistribution of wealth? And how does that redistribution of wealth look and compare in both charitable giving and uh, taxation? How do we juxtapose those two things together? And that's my reflection today: is that who do we pressure when we look at these pieces? So I ask you to, take into consideration and to, as we act, as we move forward, there are going to be lots of people who are today, you know, um, living a middle class lifestyle. Maybe they own a home. Maybe they, are your neighbor. Maybe they are looking at, they are the average blue collar worker. And maybe we call that the middle class. But I want you to really reflect on the fact that they probably are at that limited comfort level class, just making it day to day. And so, how do we support each other as community? How do we go forward as community over these next few months, without asking our neighbors, how are you doing? How are you going to make it? And so that's my reflection for today. I ask you to look at economic justice as a piece that we can share together and that we can reflect upon and we can demand change from our representatives. As I said yesterday in my reflection piece, we do not have governmental leadership. We have governmental representation. And we guide and encourage them to make ethical judgments on our behalf. So I ask you today to reflect on what does economic justice look like for all of us today. And I'll close with saying, blessed be. I invite you into a time of silence, a time when we uh, look at uh, who we are, to reflect, and to just be together. And I just realized that the mic was not turned off on this, so it went to yesterday's meditation music, but I turned that off. But I invite you to a few minutes of silence as we just reflect on maybe what does economic justice look like for us today? What is our call to be in community today and who we are? I want to thank you for joining me today. I want to invite you to join me every morning during the week. We'll do these reflections. Um, Again, I invite you to submit different types of meditation styles. Like I say, we've used music, we've used poetry. Today was more of a direct call for reflection on a topic. Tomorrow we'll use some imagery. But I want to invite you to share with me um, what types of reflections you would like to use and reflect on in the mornings. I want to thank you all for being here. And as we close our time together, may we acknowledge that we believe that there is something greater than us. We send peace to the world, recognize the divine within, and send love into the world, uh, blessing each other by saying together, Amen, Amin, Shalom, salam, namaste, and blessed be.